know that feeling, right? You're in a meeting, you get some feedback that's supposed to be helpful, but instead it just stings. It's this sharp personal feeling that you've been misunderstood, or maybe even worse, that you've been found out. Well, that's a totally universal human experience. And today we're going to decode exactly why that happens, and more importantly, what you can actually do about it. So let's kick things off with a classic scenario.
Okay, so picture this. You've just presented a project. You've poured weeks of your life into this thing. Your boss looks it over, nods, and says, "This project needs to be more creative." Now, on the surface, that's just simple professional feedback, right? It's just a note for the next draft.
But that's not really what you hear, is it? Nope. While the words are totally neutral, something happens on the journey from your ears to your brain. That message gets warped, and what actually lands is this harsh internal judgment. My work is so bland and conventional. So why? Why does our brain do this to us?
Well, the answer lies with this little character that lives inside all of our heads, the internal interpreter. Now, you gotta understand, this voice is not a reliable narrator. It's a voice that's fed by all your deepest fears and all your biggest insecurities. Its one job is to take raw data, like a piece of feedback, and translate it through the filter of your worst anxieties, whispering, "See? They're talking about you. You're just not good enough." The sting, you see, it doesn't come from the other person. It comes from your own skewed translation.
So what's powering this faulty interpreter? Well, it turns out our sensitivity isn't random at all. Psychology actually points to three really deep-seated sources of this pain that are running in the background. So let's uncover them, one by one. First up, we've got a concept from the legendary psychologist Carl Jung, and he called it the shadow. Think of the shadow as containing all the traits you've decided are just unacceptable. Things you've hidden away. Maybe it's laziness or insecurity or even envy. You basically lock these parts of yourself in the basement of your subconscious because they just don't fit the shiny image you want to show the world. And this contrast right here, it's really at the heart of the whole issue. To the world, we present what Jung called a persona, the perfect employee mask. But underneath all that lies the shadow, our secret fear that we are, in fact, totally flawed. So when a comment even hints at one of those hidden traits, it feels like they've just found the key to that locked basement. And that sting you feel, that's the terror of your perfect mask cracking, exposing everything you've tried so hard to hide. And this brings us to a really powerful metaphor that just perfectly illustrates our next point. It goes like this. If there is no wound, salt cannot hurt you. The words themselves, they're just the salt. They only cause pain when they land on an injury that's already there. The brilliant researcher Brené Brown calls these sensitive spots our open wounds. And you know what? A lot of the time, these wounds are created by the very traits we've shoved into our shadow. They're the areas of your life where you already feel vulnerable or insecure. Maybe it's public speaking, or maybe it's your leadership skills. When criticism touches one of these spots, it's excruciating. But here's the thing. This is why that sting is so valuable. It's not just pain for pain's sake, it's a map, pointing you directly to the places inside yourself that need the most self-compassion. And last but not least, we have to remember that our brains are basically running on some very, very old software. I mean, for our ancient ancestors, being accepted by the group wasn't just a nice to have. It was a literal survival mechanism. If you were judged negatively by the tribe, you could get cast out, and exile meant almost certain death. So your modern brain, it still equates criticism with this primal threat. So when your boss questions your creative abilities, a little ancient part of your brain isn't hearing feedback, it's hearing a death sentence. So, okay, we've got the shadow, we've got our open wounds, and we have this primal fear of exile, all setting the stage for pain. But that feeling becomes truly intensely painful when the criticism isn't just a random shot in the dark. No, the sharpest sting always comes when that arrow hits its mark, when it lands on a secret truth that you're trying to hide, maybe even from yourself. Now, to understand this a bit better, we can turn to another psychologist, Carl Rogers. He said that we all have two selves. First, there's your ideal self. That's the person you really want to be, super disciplined, perfectly organized, an expert in your field. And then there's your real self. That's who you actually are right now, complete with the habit of procrastinating and all the areas where you're still learning. The problem, as you might guess, starts in the gap between the two. So, when a piece of criticism comes along and shines a big, bright spotlight on that gap between your ideal and real self, it creates this powerful mental discomfort. And there's actually a scientific name for this. It's called cognitive dissonance. It's the clash between your belief, I am a creative person, and the new evidence, my boss thinks my work isn't creative. That internal conflict, that friction, that's the scientific explanation for the sting you feel. And because this dissonance feels so uncomfortable, our first instinct isn't to lean in and examine it. Oh no. It's to destroy the information that caused it in the first place. We shoot the messenger. We attack the person giving the feedback. Oh, my boss is just a micromanager. We normalize the flaw. Everyone else does it too. Or we just blame our circumstances. I just had a bad day. These are all just mental painkillers that numb the sting, but do absolutely nothing to heal the real issue underneath. So how do we stop shooting the messenger and actually start healing the wound? Well, the answer isn't to just build thicker skin. It's to start a dialogue with your own darkness. And here's a really practical 3-step method to do that, inspired by cognitive behavioral therapy.
Okay, step 1 is simple, but it's not easy. Name it. Instead of lashing out, you just pause and you identify the real emotion underneath. It's almost never just anger. It's usually shame or fear. Just acknowledging to yourself, wow, I feel ashamed right now, is a huge first step. Step 2 is to fact check. This is where you go head-to-head with your internal interpreter. You ask yourself, okay, is this one comment really evidence that I am a total failure? You separate this single event from your entire identity. And the final, most powerful step is to embrace it. This just means owning whatever grain of truth is in there without judging yourself. You simply say, yeah, this is an area I need to improve, and you know what? That's okay.
And this whole process brings us to a really critical distinction we have to make between guilt and shame. See, guilt says I did something bad. It's about an action, and because it's about an action, it can lead to positive change. But shame? Shame is toxic. It says I am bad. It's about your core identity, and it only ever leads to hiding. The goal here is to move from that toxic shame to healthy guilt, so you can focus on improving your actions, not condemning your entire character. When you can start to do this, something amazing happens. You begin to see criticism not as an attack, but as something else entirely. You can actually reframe that painful sting as a call to a deeper, more profound kind of freedom. There's this incredible freedom in this idea you can't be exposed if you are already naked. Think about that. When you stop spending all of your energy hiding your flaws and instead just choose to accept them, nobody can use them against you. When you're the one who shines a light on your own shadow, it loses all its power to haunt you. Because ultimately, the goal here isn't to become thick-skinned or numb to the world. The goal is to become wholehearted. A wholehearted person doesn't ignore criticism, they use it. If it has some truth to it, it's a valuable signpost for their own growth. And if it's false, they can just let it go, because they are secure in who they are, flaws and all. All right, so let's do a quick recap of the main takeaways. First, remember that your internal interpreter is not your friend. It's always translating feedback into the worst-case scenario. Second, that pain you feel comes from 3 deep roots: the shadow, your open wounds, and that ancient fear of exile. Third, the sting is strongest when it creates cognitive dissonance, that gap between your ideal self and your real self. But you can heal. You do it by naming the feeling, fact-checking the story, and embracing the truth. And finally, always try to remember that criticism can actually be a gift, pointing you to exactly where you need a little more self-compassion. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought. That feeling of being stung, it isn't really an attack coming from the outside. It's an alarm bell ringing from within, telling you exactly where you need to be kinder to yourself. So the real question is, what are you going to do with that information? Today, which one of your shadows will you choose to bring into the light?